Cronkite and other critics. The U.S. news media operate under an established ideology that claims they have no established ideology, no racial, gender, or class bias. Supposedly committed to no persuasion, they just report things as they see them. Now and then we hear murmurs to the contrary. For instance, for nearly 2 decades, every evening in the week, the Dean of America's Newscasters, Walter Cronkite, would end his CBS television news show with the statement, "And that's the way it is." On the eve of his retirement in 1980, Cronkite admitted, "That isn't the way it is. My lips have been kind of buttoned for almost 20 years, he said. CBS News didn't really believe in commentary, he charged. It was a remarkable admission. The man who had given honorary degrees by leading universities and who had been voted in one opinion poll the nation's most trusted public figure was saying that he had spent almost 2 decades under the censorship of network bosses. To be sure, it was a comfortable sort of repression. Cronkite's last 10-year contract with CBS went for $20 million, a sum that has been known to ease the pain of buttoned lips. But finally, Walter Cronkite had his moment of truth, yet only complained and never explained. Why was he so restricted by those who exercised such power over him? That we think the American press is a free and independent institution may only be a measure of our successful habituation in a more subtle, more familiar form of suppression. The worst forms of tyranny, or certainly the most successful ones, are not those we rail against, but those that so insinuate themselves into the imagery of our consciousness and the fabric of our lives as not to be perceived as tyranny. This is not to say the press has escaped all criticism. Indeed, more frequently than ever, the media are under attack by various quarters. First, there are salvos from the political and religious ultra-rightists. In an example of Christian right assault might be televised sermon by fundamentalist preacher Jimmy Lee Swaggart from San Antonio, Texas on November 4th, 1984. Swaggart assailed the media as godless and infected by secular humanism, which he said was a code word for atheism. He said 40% of journalists are for socialism, but of the media's undermining effects, we will not from within, without the Soviet Union having to fire a shot, he exclaimed. Having forgotten the Bible, the media have the media have difficulty recognizing what communism really is. We cooperated with the Soviets for a half-century, and all we got was subterfuge, lying, darkness, and death. The communists in Nicaragua all are slashing red paint on doors of Christians, and they'll go to every church and home and take out the people and preachers who then disappear. But our leftist bureaucrats and weak-kneed sisters in Congress block any move against communism. The media corrode family values, weaken our moral fiber, and invite interior decay and the eventual victory of the communists, the preacher concluded. Swaggart's diatribe is almost fantasy, or is mostly fantasy. However, we can see that from the ideological perspective, the media indeed do appear as atheistic, liberal, and soft on communism. I will try to show that while the media do not carry out the same kind of fire and brimstone crusade against the evils of communism desired by the radical right, they are dedicated to anti-communism in a more effective and quite thorough fashion. Not too far from the far right stands the conservative corporate community, which attacks the media for failing to show the business's side of things, and for running occasional reports about corporate pollution, wasteful defense contracts, corporate crime, the crimes of conservative political leaders, for example, Watergate. Business would prefer that the news media avoid any mention of the large profits that big business makes, especially embarrassing during hard times, and stories about unemployment, the struggles of minorities, women, and the poor, and reports on those who protest armaments, nuclear power, and corporate mistreatment of the environment. All of this, along with TV dramas like Dynasty and Dallas, which occasionally portray individual tycoons as ruthless cutthroats, convinces corporate conservatives that the media are a liberal tool bent on portraying businesses in the worst light possible. These rightist attacks help media maintain an appearance of neutrality and objectivity. The charge made by leftist critics that the media are complicit with the dominant powers seems to be refuted when these same powerful interests attack the media's supposedly anti business bias. The truth is that while the press might not totally be uncritical nor totally adultery toward the big business community, it is not an autonomous adversary, independent of the corporate class. In fact, the media underplay most of the more damaging information and commentary about corporate doings. What is reported is but the tip of the iceberg. But even this is more than business cares to endure, and is seen as an attack on the entire business system. Corporate conservatives would prefer a press dedicated to an exclusively laudatory, unblemished picture of America's businesses, complete with regular upbeat reports on the nation's economic health and business role in creating an ever-expanding prosperity. Not all criticism is from the political, religious, and corporate conservatives. Centrists and liberals, including some journalists, have criticized the press for failing to do its job of informing the American public about crucial issues. Criticism from those on the political center focus less on content than on the lack of it. They complain that the news is superficial and trivial, that it focuses on personalities rather than issues, on surface happenings rather than substantive matters, that it is more interested in entertaining than informing us. I agree with Sub's observations, and in pages ahead we'll offer supporting examples, but that kind of criticism remains more of a complaint than an analysis. When the centrist and liberal critics get around to trying to explain why stories are so poorly reported that they are likely to blame the journalists, the Columbia Journalism Review and such other publications run articles telling how stories are mishandled because reporters are misled by their sources, not well informed, or too dependent on officialdom, or indulging to their personal predilections and prejudices. These kinds of criticisms are often true, but they place too much blame on the weakest, lowest link in the news manufacturing chain. The reporter, the critics say nothing. The reporter. The critics say nothing about editors who cut and rewrite the reporter's copy and who control their jobs. They say nothing about the people who hire, fire, pay, and promote editors who exercise ultimate control over them. The centrist, liberal critique fails to note that while the journalist product may be gravely wanting in certain qualities, including objectivity and balance, it remains acceptable to the journalist's superiors. It is a kind of copy that they deem suitable for their readers. And as will be seen, the reporter who produces more penetrating stories, especially ones that reveal too much about the exploitative, undemocratic nature of capitalist society at home and abroad, will run into difficulties with their superiors. By fingering the journalist as a main and only culprit, liberal critics are implicitly treating reporters as free agents when in fact they are not. The working press works for someone other than itself. Sometimes media critics will fault not the journalists or anyone else involved in manufacturing the news, but the structure of the media themselves. By its very nature, we are told, television emphasizes the visual over the ideational. Action events, national leaders, and political candidates have a visual appeal. Issues in policy analysis do not. Hence, there is bound to be more surface than substance to the news. The problem also is said to exist, to a lesser extent, with the print media, which have limited space and time to frame the vastly complex events on a daily basis. So it is said, the media latch onto simple images and explanations in order to reduce their subject matter to an easily manageable components. There is no denying that stereotyping and reductionism are common tools of shallow thinking, but why must such shallowness be treated as inevitable. That the media so frequently resort to slick surface treatment does not mean such treatment is the only way the media can function. Rather than being a criticism, this blaming of the nature of the media is a disguised defense. It gets everyone off the hook and treats television, or whatever medium, like a disembodied technological force all on its own. However, it is not television as such that chooses to cling to surface events, but people who run it. With the right script and right intentions, visual media can offer informative and penetrating presentations on vital subjects, as demonstrated by many fine independently produced documentaries in the major news networks designed not to carry. In contrast to the above views, I argue that the news media do not fail to do their job. Rather, they perform their function all too well. Their objective is not to produce an alert, critical, and informed citizenry, the kind of people who will vote for Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, or Ronald Reagan. Their aim is to create a kind of opinion climate that makes such choices seem plausible. An opinion universe dominated by corporate and governmental elites, almost all of whom share the same ideological perspective about political and economic reality. True, these elites do not always appreciate how well they are served by a press that would be less credible and less effective if it were exclusively and more blatantly a propaganda arm of the business and government, but this does not mean the press is free and independent. The basic distortions in the media are not innocent errors, for they are not random. Rather, they move in the same overall direction again and again, favoring management over labor, corporatism over anti-corporatism, the affluent over the poor, private enterprise over socialism, whites over blacks, males over females, officialdom over protesters, conventional politics over dissonance, anti-communism and arms race militarism over disarmament, national chauvinism over internationalism. US dominance in the third world over revolutionary change. The press does many things and serves many functions, but its major role is irreducible responsibility is to continually recreate a view of reality supportive of the existing social and economic class power. That is what I will try to demonstrate in this book.